England in 1531 already possessed no shortage of methods to put a man to death: the axe, the rope, the fire, each of them public, each of them familiar. But on the 5th of April that year, something occurred at Smithfield that made the crowd fall silent. A man was lowered alive into a cauldron filled with boiling water, not because the law had always allowed it, but because a king had rewritten the law specifically to permit it. What compelled Henry VIII to make that decision, and who Richard Roose truly was, is a story that lies at the crossroads of a royal fixation, a dying bishop's kitchen, and a white powder no one can fully explain. The Tudor court operated on proximity and trust. Food was the most intimate expression of both. To poison a man's table was not simply to kill him, it was to hollow out the very structure of household loyalty, the bonds between master and servant, host and guest. When that structure fractured in February 1531, it fractured loudly enough to echo all the way to Parliament, and one cook, whose real name no one is entirely certain of, became the center of the most legally significant execution Tudor England would ever produce. A deadly kitchen plot, the poisoning that shocked Tudor England. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was not a man Henry VIII held in affection in the winter of 1531. He was vocal, principled, and obstinate, one of the few senior churchmen willing to say openly that Henry's pursuit of a marriage annulment was wrong. As Henry pressed Rome and the English Church to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a campaign now years old and still stalled, Fisher stood as one of its most prominent obstacles. He had spoken before Parliament. He had written on Catherine's behalf. He had made the kind of enemies that, in Tudor England, had a way of proving fatal. His household stood at Lambeth, just across the river from the centers of Tudor power, and on the 18th of February 1531, that household became a crime scene. That midday, pottage, a thick, common porridge, was prepared in the bishop's kitchen and served to his dining guests. The same food, as was customary, was also given to beggars who arrived at the kitchen door seeking charity. By afternoon, 16 of Fisher's guests had fallen violently ill. A household member named Bennet Kerwin died. A beggar woman named Alice Triot, who had come only seeking a meal, also died. Fisher himself had eaten nothing at lunch. Records suggest he had lost his appetite after long hours of study, which may have saved his life entirely. Suspicion fell almost immediately on the kitchen. Fisher's brother Richard, who managed the household, ordered the cook arrested within hours. The man at the center of it, known variously as Richard Rouse, Richard Rose, or Richard Cook, his true surname apparently uncertain even to contemporaries, had already fled the house. He was tracked down elsewhere in London and brought in for questioning. Within days, he found himself in the Tower. There, on the rack, Roose confessed. He admitted to adding a powder to the pottage. His explanation was striking. He claimed a stranger had given him the powder and that he believed it to be a mild purgative, something meant to cause discomfort among his fellow servants as a practical joke. He had not intended, he said, to kill anyone. Whether that account was true or simply the only story he could construct under torture that might keep him alive a little longer is something no record can resolve. The stranger was never identified. The powder was never recovered, and the two people who had eaten most heavily were dead. News of the poisoning spread quickly through London and Westminster. The scholar Derek Wilson later described a wave of horror descending on the property-owning classes as the story circulated. Poison was a uniquely disturbing crime in the Tudor world, not because death itself was unfamiliar, but because poisoning required no confrontation, no visible force. A servant could destroy a great household from within the kitchen, invisibly, and be gone before anyone knew what had happened. That invisibility terrified people in a way that more open violence did not. And then the question that had been forming in private began to surface in public. Had someone put Roose up to it? If so, who? Fisher had enemies of consequence. The Boleyn family made no secret of their frustration with him. Cannonballs were reportedly fired at Fisher's property in the weeks following the poisoning, with the trajectory suggesting they came from the direction of Durham House, where Thomas Boleyn resided. Anne Boleyn and her family found themselves named in whispers across the city. There was no evidence then, and there is none now, that any of them had any role in what happened in that kitchen. But suspicion in Tudor England did not require evidence. It required only proximity to a motive, and the Boleyns had motive in abundance: confession under pressure, a stranger who never existed, and a crime that struck at the heart of trust itself. These were the fragments from which the Crown would construct its response. Confession under pressure, a trial. Driven by royal fear, Henry VIII did not simply allow the law to take its course. He inserted himself into the proceedings with unusual force, and on the 28th of February, 1531, just 10 days after the poisoning, he appeared before the House of Lords and spoke at length against the crime. Contemporary accounts describe a speech lasting well over an hour. Henry argued that poisoning represented a unique and exceptional threat to civilized order, distinct from other forms of killing precisely because of its secrecy and its ability to strike at the foundations of household and community trust. No sword, no axe, no visible act of aggression, just something placed quietly into a pot in a kitchen by hands that were supposed to be trusted. It was the intimacy of the betrayal, Henry argued, that demanded a response unlike anything already written into law. The result was a piece of legislation unlike anything Parliament had passed before. The Act for Poisoning, formally enacted in 1531, reclassified murder by poison not as ordinary homicide, but as high treason, and it mandated a specific punishment to match: death by boiling. The punishment was framed as a kind of judicial mirror. A man who had used cooking to kill would himself be cooked. The Act also compared poisoning to the crime of coining counterfeit currency, which similarly harmed not just individuals, but the broader social fabric. Both crimes, in the language of the law, operated through deception and subverted the foundations on which ordered society depended. It also contained a provision stripping the condemned of the benefit of clergy, meaning no priest could attend the execution to hear confession or offer last rites. Roose would die outside the sacramental framework entirely. What makes the legal handling of Rose's case significant beyond the punishment itself is how completely it bypassed ordinary process. Roose was not tried before a jury. He was attainted by Act of Parliament, a procedure that allowed the legislature to declare a person guilty and sentence them without a conventional trial. He was not permitted to offer a formal defense. The bill named him, condemned him, and prescribed his death. Historians have noted that this use of parliamentary attainder against a man of no political standing marked a legal watershed. Before this, attainder had generally been reserved for those whose cases were too politically sensitive for ordinary courts: great nobles, conspirators, men with powerful connections. Using it on a cook set a precedent that Henry's government would use in far more consequential ways in the years ahead. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, writing to the emperor in the weeks surrounding Rose's case, offered a particularly sharp reading of Henry's motives. He suggested the king had become personally invested in ensuring Rose was punished with maximum severity, partly to deflect suspicion that, regardless of its basis, was circulating about people close to Henry himself. Whether Henry believed Rose had acted alone or suspected otherwise and chose not to pursue it, no record makes clear. What is clear is that he wanted the matter resolved with a kind of finality that made further questions politically difficult to ask. Roose sat in the Tower through the early weeks of 1531, convicted without having stood trial, denied the rights of his faith, and fully aware of what Parliament had decreed would happen to him. The law existed now. The date was being set. The location would be Smithfield, the same ground that had witnessed heretic burnings and public spectacles for generations, and the method would be one so extreme that even within a century the English legal system would decide it had gone too far. Whatever Rose understood of the legal machinery that had been constructed around him, he had no path left. The Act of Parliament was the verdict and the sentence, combined into one irreversible document. A man whose true name history cannot even confirm was about to die in a way history would never forget. Smithfield's Cauldron, Richard Rose's brutal execution. Smithfield in the 16th century was one of London's principal stages for public death. It stood just outside the city walls, open enough for crowds, familiar enough to be tied in the public mind to the theater of justice. Heretics had burned there. Criminals had hanged there. On the 5th of April, 1531, it offered something it had never offered before. A man boiled alive before a watching crowd. Death by boiling was not instantaneous. Sources from the period describe the condemned being bound and lowered, or in some accounts fastened to a chain that could be raised and dropped into a large cauldron of water kept at temperature over a sustained fire. The Chronicles of the Grey Friars, later published by the Camden Society, record an earlier boiling at Smithfield in 1522, in which a condemned man was fastened to a chain and lowered into boiling water repeatedly. Whether Roose's execution followed that exact pattern, or some variation of it, is not preserved in precise detail. What one contemporary account does preserve is this: he roared mighty loud. Those words carry weight precisely because of their restraint. No elaboration, no dramatization, just that single detail, recorded as if the witness could think of nothing else sufficient to say. The crowd that gathered to watch was reportedly shocked and sickened. That reaction itself is revealing. Tudor Londoners were not strangers to public death. They had watched burnings and beheadings with the composure of people for whom such things were routine civic rituals. That a crowd accustomed to executions found this one disturbing enough to remember as something different says much about what boiling alive truly looked like and sounded like. Roose died without confession, without last rites, and without any clergyman present. The Act of Parliament had stripped him of that right. For a man of the 16th century, dying outside the sacramental protection of the Church carried a significance that modern secular life can only partially grasp. It was not merely a painful death. It was, within the theological framework of his world, a spiritually compromised one. Whether the man lowered into that cauldron understood the full legal and spiritual meaning of what had been done to him, no source records. He left behind no final statement, no appeal, no last words. He entered the record as Richard Roose, departed it with a roar, and was gone. The legal afterlife of his execution proved almost as revealing as the execution itself. The 1531 Act remained in force only briefly. Under Edward VI, Henry's son, it was repealed. The official reasoning described the punishment as excessively extreme, outside the acceptable limits of judicial killing. Edward's reign moved, in several respects, toward moderating the most spectacular forms of Tudor brutality. That boiling alive was among the first punishments his Parliament chose to eliminate, speaks to how far beyond even that era's tolerance it had gone. The questions surrounding the poisoning never fully disappeared. John Fisher survived 1531, continued opposing Henry's religious policies, and was eventually executed in 1535, beheaded on Tower Hill after refusing to accept Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. The fact that the man Roose was accused of trying to kill was himself killed by the Crown only 4 years later gave the entire episode a grim symmetry. The bishop who had escaped the poisoned pottage could not escape the axe. Whether the powder was ever truly meant for Fisher, or whether Roose was exactly what he claimed, a man who believed he was carrying out a foolish prank, remains unknown. The stranger who gave him the powder was never found. No accomplice was ever charged. The suspicion voiced at the time that powerful figures may have preferred the investigation to end where it did has never been resolved. What the case left behind was more than the memory of one cook's death. It left a legal template. The use of parliamentary attainder to condemn without trial became a tool Henry's government would use again and again in the years that followed, against theologians, ministers, nobles, and even queens. The legal machinery tested on a kitchen servant would later be turned on the powerful. The system outlived the man. The punishment did not. In a justice system built on visibility, where suffering served as warning and crowds were part of the sentence, the boiling of Richard Roose became a statement that briefly exceeded even the Tudor state's appetite for spectacle. If you had stood at Smithfield that day, would you have watched to the end or looked away? The crowd that gathered in April 1531 made its choice. History recorded it without judgment and left the roar to speak for itself.